For 194 hours, 554 American soldiers were trapped in a forest valley surrounded by thousands of German troops. They had no food, almost no water, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. But the worst part wasn't the enemy in front of them. It was their own artillery raining down shells from behind, killing the very men they were supposed to protect. The commander sent carrier pigeon after carrier pigeon begging headquarters to stop the bombardment. All were shot down by German snipers, except one. This is the story of the Lost Battalion, one of World War I's most harrowing battles, and the friendly fire controversy that haunts it to this day. In this video, you'll discover the hour-by-hour account of what really happened during those 194 hours in the Argonne Forest. You'll learn how these soldiers became trapped, the brutal conditions they endured, the desperate attempts to reach them, and the controversial decisions that cost American lives. Using first-hand accounts from survivors, military records, and recently analyzed evidence, we're finally telling the complete story of America's Lost Battalion. To understand how these men became trapped, we need to go back to October 1918. World War I had been raging for 4 years, and the Allies were launching what they hoped would be the final offensive to break German lines. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the largest American military operation in history up to that point. Over 1 million American soldiers were committed to pushing through the Argonne Forest and breaking the German defensive line that had held for years. The 77th Infantry Division, composed mostly of draftees from New York City, was assigned to advance through some of the most difficult terrain in the sector. These weren't hardened frontline veterans. Many were immigrants who barely spoke English. They were shopkeepers, factory workers, and office clerks who had been in uniform for less than a year. But they were ordered to advance, and advance they did. On October 2, 1918, Major Charles Whittlesey received orders to push forward aggressively. His battalion, along with elements of several other units, was to advance through a heavily forested ravine and capture German positions. The plan assumed that units on their flanks would advance simultaneously, maintaining a continuous line. But that's not what happened. Whittlesey's battalion surged forward and penetrated deep into German territory. The units on their flanks, however, were stopped by fierce resistance and couldn't keep pace. By the afternoon of October 2nd, Whittlesey realized his situation. His force of approximately 550 men was now surrounded on 3 sides by German troops, with their rear also cut off. They had advanced into a pocket, a steep valley that would become their prison for the next 8 days. The men quickly dug in, creating foxholes and improvised defenses. They had some rations, limited medical supplies, and ammunition, but no one knew how long they'd need to hold out. The Germans recognized the opportunity immediately. They had trapped a significant American force and began tightening the noose. Machine gun positions were established on the ridges above the valley, giving them perfect fields of fire. Snipers picked off anyone who moved, and German infantry began probing the American perimeter, looking for weak points. The Lost Battalion, as they would later be called, was in desperate trouble. Hour by hour, the situation deteriorated. On October 3rd, the men realized their food was running out. Rations that were supposed to last days were gone in 24 hours. Water became the most critical problem. The only water source was a small stream at the bottom of the ravine, completely exposed to German fire. Men who tried to reach it were shot. The wounded, and there were many, suffered terribly without adequate water. Some soldiers resorted to drinking from muddy shell holes, risking disease. Communication was nearly impossible. Whittlesey had carrier pigeons, the most reliable communication method in the forest where radio signals couldn't penetrate, and runners were killed trying to reach headquarters. He sent pigeon after pigeon with messages describing their position and desperate situation. Most were shot down by German marksmen who watched for them. The Germans knew that cutting off communication would isolate the battalion psychologically as well as physically. By October 4th, ammunition was becoming scarce. The men were under near constant attack. German infantry would assault the perimeter, be driven back, then assault again. Each attack depleted American ammunition reserves. Soldiers were ordered to fire only when they had clear targets. At night, Germans would call out in English, trying to trick Americans into revealing their positions or surrendering. The psychological pressure was immense. Then came the friendly fire. On October 4th, American artillery began shelling the ravine where the battalion was trapped. The shells came from behind American lines, fired by artillerymen who had no idea their own troops were in the target zone. Explosions ripped through the American positions. Men who had survived German attacks were torn apart by their own artillery. The wounded screamed. Survivors huddled in their foxholes, helpless against the bombardment from their own side. Whittlesey frantically wrote messages and sent them via pigeon, begging headquarters to stop the artillery fire. But the pigeons were shot down. Message after message failed to get through. The shelling continued. For For the men in the pocket, this was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their ordeal. They could fight Germans. They understood that enemy. But being killed by their own artillery, by men who were supposed to be protecting them, was psychologically devastating. Finally, Whittlesey had one pigeon left. A bird named Cher Ami. On October 4th, he wrote a desperate message. "Here am I. For heaven's sake, stop it." He attached the message to Cher Ami and released the bird. German soldiers saw it immediately and opened fire. Cher Ami was hit, shot through the chest, blinded in one eye, with a leg hanging by a tendon. But the bird kept flying. Despite horrific injuries, Cher Ami flew 25 miles through enemy fire back to American headquarters, delivering the message in just 25 minutes. The artillery fire stopped. Cher Ami had saved the lost battalion. But the ordeal was far from over. October 5th and 6th brought more German attacks. The battalion's perimeter was shrinking as men were killed or wounded. Medical supplies were exhausted. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations with no morphine, no bandages, nothing but the courage of their medics who worked barehanded. Some men, delirious from thirst and hunger, began to break mentally. Others showed extraordinary resilience, sharing what little they had and maintaining discipline under impossible conditions. The Germans tried a different tactic. They sent an American prisoner, looted of his uniform, under a white flag with a surrender demand. The message, written in English, stated that the battalion was hopelessly surrounded and should surrender to avoid further bloodshed. It was signed by a German commander and promised honorable treatment. Whittlesey's response was immediate and defiant. He refused. The men, despite their suffering, supported the decision. They would not surrender. Outside the pocket, American forces were fighting desperately to break through. Multiple relief attempts were launched. Each one was thrown back by German defenses. American casualties mounted as units tried to reach the trapped battalion. The 77th Division was taking tremendous losses in these relief efforts, losses that some historians argue exceeded the number of men they were trying to save. This raised difficult questions then and now about command decisions. By October 7th, the situation was critical. Men were dying from wounds that would have been treatable with proper medical care. Others were succumbing to exposure, hunger, and exhaustion. The battalion had been reduced to fewer than 200 men capable of fighting. German attacks continued, though the Germans themselves were suffering heavy casualties. It had become a battle of attrition that neither side could afford, but neither would abandon. Finally, on October 7th and 8th, American forces managed to break through German lines. The 77th Division, reinforced and regrouped, launched a massive assault that pushed the Germans back. On the afternoon of October 8th, American troops reached the lost battalion's perimeter. The siege was over. Of the original 554 men, only 194 walked out unharmed. Another 194 were wounded. The rest were dead or missing. The survivors were in terrible condition. Most had lost significant weight. Many suffered from trench foot, exposure, and dehydration. The psychological trauma was evident. These men had endured 8 days of hell, surrounded, starving, and at one point bombed by their own artillery. Yet they had held. They had not surrendered. They had maintained discipline and military effectiveness against overwhelming odds. The Lost Battalion became an instant symbol of American courage and determination. The press celebrated them as heroes. Whittlesey and several others received the Medal of Honor. Cher Ami, the pigeon who delivered the crucial message, became a national hero and was awarded the French Croix de Guerre. The bird survived its injuries and lived another year before dying from its wounds. Cher Ami's body was preserved and is now displayed at the Smithsonian. But behind the heroic narrative were uncomfortable questions. Why was the battalion ordered to advance so far without flank support? Why did commanders not recognize the danger sooner? How did American artillery end up shelling their own troops? And most controversially, were the relief attempts properly coordinated, or did command failures compound the tragedy? The friendly fire incident remains particularly contentious. Investigations after the battle revealed that American artillery positions had outdated maps and incorrect information about frontline positions. Communication breakdowns between infantry and artillery units meant that artillery officers genuinely did not know American troops were in their target zone. The system had failed, and American soldiers paid the price. This led to significant reforms in how artillery support was coordinated. Some historians have argued that the Lost Battalion shouldn't have been lost at all. They suggest that Whittlesey was too aggressive in following his orders, advancing beyond what was prudent. Others counter that Whittlesey was following explicit orders to advance, and that the fault lay with higher command for not ensuring flank support. These debates continue among military historians today. What's undeniable is the extraordinary courage shown by the men of the Lost Battalion.
They endured conditions that would break most people. They maintained military discipline when chaos would have been understandable. They fought on when survival seemed impossible. And they refused to surrender despite being offered a way out. That kind of determination defines the best of military service. The Lost Battalion story also highlights the brutal reality of World War I combat. This wasn't a glorious cavalry charge or a decisive tank breakthrough. It was men huddled in muddy holes, starving, wounded, terrified, being shelled by both sides, watching friends die, and still refusing to quit. World War I was a war of attrition and endurance, and the Lost Battalion embodied both. The legacy of the Lost Battalion influenced American military doctrine. The incident prompted serious examination of communication systems, artillery coordination, and the risks of units advancing without secured flanks. Lessons learned from this tragedy saved lives in future conflicts. That doesn't diminish the suffering of the Lost Battalion, but it gives their ordeal meaning beyond the immediate battle. Today, the story of the Lost Battalion is taught in military academies as a case study in leadership, endurance, and the fog of war. Major Charles Whittlesey's decisions, both celebrated and questioned, are analyzed by officer candidates. The friendly fire incident is studied in artillery schools, and the overall battle serves as a reminder of how quickly military situations can spiral out of control. For 194 hours, 554 American soldiers held a small patch of forest against overwhelming odds. They survived German attacks, starvation, thirst, and their own artillery. They emerged as symbols of American military determination. But they were also victims of command failures and the chaotic, brutal nature of modern warfare. Their story is one of heroism and tragedy, of courage and controversy, of men who did their duty even when that duty demanded everything they had. The Lost Battalion was never truly lost. They knew exactly where they were. It was everyone else who couldn't reach them, and that makes their story even more haunting.